The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as tourists gathered around the imposing gates of Windsor Castle. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a brash American businessman in his mid-40s, expensive camera hanging from his neck and designer sunglasses perched on his head despite the overcast British sky. He had flown to London specifically for this moment, bragging to his colleagues back in Chicago about how he would get the perfect shot with the famous Queen's Guard. Marcus pushed through the crowd of respectful visitors, his loud voice cutting through the reverent whispers of other tourists. He wore a bright Hawaiian shirt that clashed terribly with the historic surroundings, khaki shorts and white sneakers that squeaked against the ancient stones. His wife Sarah trailed behind him, clearly embarrassed by his behavior, tugging at his sleeve and whispering for him to lower his voice. The royal guard stood motionless at his post, a magnificent figure in his iconic red tunic and tall black bearskin hat. Guardsman James Mitchell had been serving for 3 years, trained to maintain absolute composure regardless of the situation. His polished black boots reflected the morning light, and his ceremonial rifle stood perfectly vertical beside him. The young man's face remained expressionless, eyes fixed straight ahead, embodying centuries of British military tradition. Other tourists maintained a respectful distance, snapping photos from afar and speaking in hushed tones. They understood they were witnessing something sacred, a living piece of history. Children pointed in wonder while their parents explained the significance of the guard's duty. Japanese tourists bowed slightly before taking their pictures. German families whispered explanations to their children, and elderly British visitors watched with obvious pride. Marcus, however, seemed oblivious to the atmosphere of respect surrounding him. He complained loudly about the crowds, criticizing the weather, and made disparaging comments about British customs that made nearby tourists cringe. His wife repeatedly apologized to those around them, her face growing redder with each of her husband's outbursts. She had tried to research proper etiquette before their trip, but Marcus had dismissed her concerns as unnecessary worry. The businessman circled the guard like a predator stalking prey, looking for the perfect angle. He adjusted his camera settings, repeatedly, muttering about lighting conditions and background composition. Other visitors began to notice his aggressive behavior, stepping back to give him space while exchanging concerned glances. Some parents pulled their children closer, sensing the tension building in the air. Guardsman Mitchell remained perfectly still, but those who knew what to look for might have noticed the slightest tightening around his eyes. He had dealt with difficult tourists before, but something about this man's entitled attitude set him apart from the usual boundary pushers. The guard's training had prepared him for many scenarios, but each situation required careful judgment about when to act and when to endure. As Marcus continued his theatrical photography session, snapping dozens of pictures from every conceivable angle, the crowd began to sense that something was building toward an inevitable confrontation. The respectful atmosphere that had pervaded the courtyard began to shift, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to electrify the very air around the ancient castle walls. Marcus grew increasingly frustrated with his shots, convinced he needed something more dramatic to impress his social media followers back home. He had promised his business partners he would return with photos that would make them jealous, and standard tourist shots simply would not suffice. His expensive camera clicked rapidly as he moved closer to the guard, ignoring the subtle rope barriers that indicated the appropriate distance for visitors. Sarah grabbed her husband's arm more firmly now, her voice taking on an urgent whisper. She had noticed the disapproving stares from other tourists, and the way security personnel had begun to position themselves with clearer sightlines to her husband's location. Her research had warned her about the strict protocols surrounding the royal guards, and she could feel the situation spiraling beyond her control. The guard remained statue-like, but perspiration had begun to form beneath his heavy ceremonial uniform. The summer heat was always challenging, but today felt particularly intense with the growing crowd and the escalating situation. His years of training echoed in his mind: maintain position, assess threats, protect the dignity of the crown. Every muscle in his body remained disciplined, even as his peripheral vision tracked the approaching tourist. Other visitors began pulling out their own phones, not to photograph the guard, but to potentially document what they sensed might become an incident worth recording. The elderly British gentleman shook his head disapprovingly and muttered something about American tourists to his wife. A group of French students whispered among themselves, debating whether they should alert security or simply wait to see what would happen. Marcus stepped over the first barrier rope, his expensive sneakers now on consecrated ground that had been walked by royalty for centuries. The crowd collectively held its breath, recognizing that an invisible line had been crossed. Security guards immediately took notice, speaking quietly into their communication devices while moving strategically through the crowd to maintain clear sight lines. The businessman was now close enough to see the intricate details of the guard's uniform, the precise stitching, the gleaming buttons, the perfect alignment of every element. He raised his camera again, this time aiming for extreme close-ups that would showcase these details. In his mind, he was creating art, capturing history in a way that would set his photography apart from typical tourist snapshots. Guardsman Mitchell's breathing remained controlled and rhythmic, but his awareness had shifted to high alert. Protocol dictated specific responses to different levels of intrusion, and this tourist was rapidly approaching the threshold that would require action. The weight of his ceremonial rifle felt heavier now, not because of its physical mass but because of the responsibility it represented. The atmosphere in the courtyard had completely transformed. What began as a peaceful morning of sightseeing had evolved into a tense standoff between tradition and entitlement. Other tourists formed a wider circle around the scene, simultaneously wanting to maintain respectful distance while ensuring they did not miss whatever was about to unfold. The ancient stone seemed to absorb the collective anxiety of everyone present. Emboldened by what he perceived as the guard's complete passivity, Marcus made his fatal error in judgment. He stepped forward again, now within arm's reach of Guardsman Mitchell, and decided that a regular photograph was insufficient for his purposes. He wanted something interactive, something that would prove his boldness to friends back home who had warned him about the strict formality of British customs. With shocking audacity, Marcus reached out and placed his hand directly on the guard's ceremonial rifle, positioning himself for what he imagined would be the ultimate tourist selfie. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible, a sound that seemed to echo off the ancient castle walls like a warning bell. His wife Sarah actually stumbled backward in horror, covering her mouth with her hands as she realized her husband had just committed an unthinkable violation. The moment Marcus's fingers made contact with the weapon, several things happened simultaneously. Security personnel immediately began moving toward the scene with increased urgency. Their casual observation transformed into active intervention mode. Other tourists instinctively stepped further back, recognizing that they were about to witness something unprecedented in their sightseeing experience. For Guardsman Mitchell, this physical contact with his ceremonial weapon represented far more than simple tourist rudeness. It was a direct assault on the dignity of the crown, a violation of sacred trust and a breach of security protocols that demanded immediate response. His 3 years of training crystallized into a single moment of perfect clarity about what must happen next. The guard's transformation from statue to active soldier was so sudden and dramatic that it seemed almost supernatural. In one fluid motion that demonstrated years of military precision, he pivoted toward the tourist while simultaneously adjusting his grip on his rifle. His voice, when it finally broke the silence he had maintained for hours, cut through the air like a cavalry charge. Marcus, still holding his camera in one hand and touching the rifle with the other, suddenly found himself face to face with a very real soldier whose patience had been exhausted. The businessman's confident smirk vanished instantly, replaced by confusion and then growing alarm as he began to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. The crowd's reaction was immediate and intense. Camera phones emerged from pockets and purses as tourists realized they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. Some visitors continued backing away, while others pressed closer, torn between safety concerns and the desire to capture this historic moment of confrontation. Sarah Thompson felt her knees weaken as she watched her husband's bravado crumble in real time. She had spent their entire marriage trying to moderate his tendency toward inappropriate behavior, but this situation was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Her mind raced between embarrassment, fear for her husband's safety, and anger at his stubborn refusal to respect the customs of their host country. Guardsman Mitchell's voice thundered across the courtyard with centuries of military authority. behind every word. His command was not a request or a suggestion. It was an absolute order delivered with the full weight of royal protocol and British military tradition. The sound seemed to reverberate off every stone surface, creating an acoustic effect that made his words feel both immediate and eternal. Marcus stumbled backward so quickly that he nearly dropped his expensive camera, his face cycling rapidly through expressions of shock, confusion, and dawning terror. The businessman who had spent his entire adult life convinced that money and American citizenship could smooth over any social difficulty suddenly found himself confronted with an authority that recognized neither. His designer sunglasses fell from his head and clattered against the ancient cobblestones. The guard's posture had transformed completely from ceremonial stillness to active military bearing. Every line of his body communicated readiness, discipline, and absolute commitment to his duty. His eyes, which had stared straight ahead for hours, now fixed directly on Marcus with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the tourist's remaining bravado, like a laser cutting through paper. Security personnel materialized around the scene with professional efficiency, their casual observation transformed into coordinated response. They moved with the practiced calm of individuals who had trained for exactly this type of situation, creating a secure perimeter while maintaining clear communication with their command structure. Their presence added another layer of official gravity to what Marcus had foolishly imagined would be a harmless photo opportunity. The crowd's reaction reached a crescendo of whispered exclamations, nervous laughter, and the distinctive clicking sounds of dozens of camera phones capturing every moment of the confrontation. Tourists from multiple countries found themselves united in their shared amazement at witnessing such spectacular disrespect and its immediate consequences. Children pointed while their parents tried to explain the significance of what they were seeing. Sarah finally found her voice and rushed forward, her face flushed with embarrassment and genuine fear for her husband's well-being. She began apologizing profusely to everyone within hearing distance, her words tumbling over each other in her desperation to somehow repair the damage her husband had inflicted on this sacred space. Her attempts to physically pull Marcus away from the guard were both urgent and gentle, reflecting her understanding that any sudden movements might escalate the situation further. Marcus himself seemed frozen between competing impulses, his natural inclination toward defiant entitlement, warring with a growing recognition that he had wandered into territory where his usual tactics would not only fail but might actually make things significantly worse. The color drained from his face as the full implications of his actions began to penetrate his consciousness. The ancient courtyard, which had witnessed countless historical moments over the centuries, now hosted this perfect collision between old-world dignity and new-world presumption. Every tourist present understood they were witnessing something that would become a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. A moment when tradition asserted itself against the forces that constantly threatened to diminish its significance. What happened next would become the defining moment that transformed this incident from a simple tourist mishap into a viral sensation that would be discussed across social media platforms worldwide. Guardsman Mitchell, having issued his thunderous command, did not return to his ceremonial position. Instead, he maintained his active military stance and delivered what would become known as the most perfectly executed verbal discipline in modern Royal Guard history. His words came in measured, crystal-clear sentences that cut through the morning air with surgical precision. He explained, in language that everyone present could understand, exactly why Marcus's behavior was not merely rude, but represented a fundamental assault on institutions that had protected British sovereignty for centuries. Every syllable was delivered with the kind of authority that comes only from genuine conviction and years of dedicated service. Marcus found himself completely speechless for perhaps the first time in his adult life. The businessman who had built his career on aggressive negotiation tactics and intimidating presentations stood before this young soldier like a schoolboy being disciplined by the headmaster. His expensive camera hung, forgotten around his neck as he struggled to process the reality that his wealth and status meant absolutely nothing in this context. The crowd had grown substantially as word of the confrontation spread through the castle grounds. Tourists abandoned other attractions to witness this unprecedented scene, creating a natural amphitheater around the central drama. The collective silence was so profound that every word from the guard carried to the furthest edges of the gathering. ensuring that hundreds of people heard his complete response to Marcus's violation. Security personnel maintained their professional positions but made no move to intervene in what was clearly a perfectly handled situation. Their respect for Guardsman Mitchell was evident in their restraint, allowing him to address the situation according to his training and judgment, rather than rushing to take control from him. This vote of confidence from his colleagues added another layer of authority to his response. Thompson stood frozen between mortification and a strange sense of pride in witnessing such a masterful display of dignity under pressure. Despite her embarrassment over her husband's behavior, she found herself genuinely moved by the guard's articulate defense of his duties and traditions. Her own respect for British customs, which Marcus had consistently mocked, felt validated by this moment of perfect institutional response. The guard's words were not delivered with anger or personal animosity, but rather with the kind of calm, professional authority that made them far more powerful than any emotional outburst could have been. He spoke as a representative of something much larger than himself, channeling centuries of tradition and the dignity of service to crown and country. As his response concluded, Guardsman Mitchell returned to his ceremonial position with the same fluid precision he had demonstrated when first responding to Marcus's violation. The transformation back to statue-like stillness was so smooth and complete that observers might have questioned whether the entire confrontation had actually occurred, were it not for the dozens of video recordings that would soon make their way onto the internet. The aftermath of Guardsman Mitchell's response created a ripple effect that spread far beyond the immediate courtyard. Security personnel approached Marcus and Sarah with professional courtesy, but unmistakable firmness, explaining that they would need to complete an incident report and that their visit to the castle grounds would be concluding immediately. The businessman who had arrived that morning expecting to capture trophy photographs found himself being escorted away in front of hundreds of witnesses. Marcus's humiliation was complete and very public. As security led him away, he caught glimpses of tourists holding up their phones, clearly having recorded the entire incident. His mind raced with horrifying visions of his professional colleagues back in Chicago, watching videos of his spectacular failure to navigate basic social protocols. The confident swagger that had characterized his approach to the guard was replaced by a defeated shuffle as he struggled to process the magnitude of his miscalculation. Sarah followed her husband with a mixture of relief and lingering embarrassment. Part of her felt grateful that the situation had been handled with such dignity, rather than escalating into something that might have involved law enforcement or international diplomatic complications. However, she also knew that their relationship would need serious discussion about respect, boundaries, and her husband's tendency to treat the entire world as his personal entertainment venue. The crowd that had witnessed the confrontation began to disperse, but their conversations buzzed with excitement and analysis of what they had just experienced. Multiple languages could be heard as tourists from around the world shared their interpretations of the event, many expressing admiration for the guard's professionalism and dismay at Marcus's behavior. Several visitors approached the area where Guardsman Mitchell had resumed his post, offering quiet words of support and appreciation. Within hours, videos of the incident began appearing on social media platforms with captions like "Tourist learns hard lesson about respect and Royal Guard delivers perfect response to entitled American." The footage spread rapidly across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, accumulating millions of views and generating thousands of comments from people around the world who felt the guard's response represented a perfect defense of tradition and dignity. News outlets picked up the story by evening, with British media treating it as a point of national pride, while American news organizations approached it as either a cautionary tale about cultural sensitivity or an example of excessive formality, depending on their editorial perspectives. International media found in the incident a perfect microcosm of broader tensions between traditional authority and modern informality. Guardsman Mitchell himself remained at his post for the remainder of his shift, maintaining the same perfect composure he had demonstrated throughout the entire incident. Fellow guards and castle staff made sure to express their support and admiration for his handling of the situation, recognizing that he had upheld the highest standards of their service while educating the public about the importance of their duties. The incident became a training example within military circles, demonstrating how to maintain dignity and authority while dealing with civilian misconduct. Military instructors would later use footage of Mitchell's response to illustrate proper escalation procedures and the importance of clear, measured communication during tense situations. Months after the incident, the confrontation between Marcus Thompson and Guardsman Mitchell had evolved into something approaching internet legend. The video accumulated over 50 million views across various platforms, spawning countless reaction videos, memes, and detailed analyses of British military protocol. Marcus found himself the unwilling star of a viral sensation that followed him long after he returned to Chicago, where colleagues and clients would reference that Castle video in business. Meetings. The businessman's perspective on the incident underwent a gradual transformation as the initial embarrassment gave way to reluctant understanding. After watching the video multiple times and reading hundreds of comments from people around the world explaining the significance of Royal Guard duties, Marcus began to comprehend the depth of his cultural misunderstanding. His wife Sarah encouraged this reflection, using the experience as a catalyst for broader discussions about respect, privilege, and personal growth. Guardsman Mitchell received official commendation for his handling of the situation, with superior officers praising his perfect balance of firm authority and professional restraint. The incident became a source of pride within his regiment, demonstrating to the world that the ceremonial aspects of their duties did not diminish their fundamental role as active soldiers protecting important institutions. His response was incorporated into official training materials for future guards. Tourism at Windsor Castle actually increased following the viral video, with many visitors expressing hope that they might witness similar demonstrations of traditional British military discipline. However, the vast majority of tourists displayed notably improved behavior around the guards, suggesting that Marcus's public humiliation had served an educational purpose for potential boundary crossers worldwide. The incident sparked broader conversations about cultural respect, social media behavior, and the responsibilities that come with representing one's country while traveling abroad. Educational institutions began using the footage in courses about cross-cultural communication, while military academies found it valuable for discussions about maintaining dignity under pressure. Sarah Thompson eventually wrote a blog post about the experience that went viral in its own right, titled, "What My Husband's Viral Humiliation Taught Us About Respect." Her thoughtful analysis of American tourist behavior and the importance of cultural sensitivity resonated with millions of readers, turning what could have remained purely a source of family embarrassment into a teaching moment for a global audience. For Guardsman Mitchell, the incident became a defining moment of his military service, though he continued to approach his duties with the same quiet professionalism that had made his response so effective. Colleagues noted that he never boasted about the attention or treated his viral fame as anything more than confirmation that he had done his job correctly when tested under unusual circumstances. The ancient courtyard of Windsor Castle returned to its normal rhythms of respectful tourism and ceremonial duty, but the Stones had witnessed something that would be remembered long after the current generation of guards had completed their service. The confrontation had demonstrated that some traditions possess an inner strength that cannot be diminished by casual disrespect, and that dignity, when properly defended, becomes a powerful force that resonates far beyond its immediate context. Marcus Thompson learned this lesson in the most public way possible, while millions of viewers around the world absorbed the same message through his experience, creating a lasting impact that extended far beyond one tourist's momentary lapse in judgment.